Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Young Cape podcast. I'm Robert Digan, and here I am with Christopher Clohessy, Father Christopher Clohessy, Catholic priest, formerly of Cape Town, who that you are most well known at the moment for your scholarship, your scholarly research into the early days of Shia Islam, which is a very interesting dimension, particularly for people who are curious about the interfaith relationships in the Cape. And I thought I'd start there because it's a very peculiar question. When you have such a heavily doctrinal sort of system that any of the Abrahamic religions tend to have a very sort of exclusive approach. There is only this way. And I don't think the Catholic Church is an exception. And so I think people will be quite curious as to what drew you to look into Shia Islam with such in such detail.
Well, I, of course, grew up in Cape Town, studied for the priesthood in Pretoria, worked for years in Cape Town itself, and especially in areas which were predominantly Muslim, so Manenberg, parts of Mitchell's Plain. In fact, almost always the areas I worked in were highly dominated by Islam or by evangelical kind of American-style born-again Christianity, which is very interesting parallel. These two particular brands should attract people because they do give a certain identity to people. And of course, also in places dominated by huge social, societal problems in terms of drugs and alcohol and gangsters. I became interested in Islam there mostly because I worked quite closely with some of the Islamic leaders on the issues of societal problems in a place like Manenberg, because Manenberg was like a cancer victim to whom we were giving first aid, just wasn't working. And we soon discovered that social leaders, religious leaders, had to work together to try and find solutions. And so I got on quite well with the Islamic leaders, but I was also aware that many of my own parishioners had members who converted to Islam and become Muslim for various reasons, and that one couldn't just ignore this. So I ended up, of course, in Egypt studying Arabic and in Rome, because I thought that perhaps we need to do something academical, that a study of Islam, like any religion, needs to be on an academic rather than an emotional level. And I happened to choose to specialize in Shia Islam because very few Western scholars ever bothered. It's a minority, it's a tiny group within Islam. Whereas I found certain resonances, certain echoes between the sort of ritualistic passion of Catholicism and the ritualistic passion of the Shia. And I found those resonances quite strong, and that's why I specialized in Shia Islam.
Well, that's very interesting. It's very interesting that you say that, because often one encounters online arguments between various Muslims, and there's a sort of accusation that is made sometimes that Shia is just sort of Christianity light. For someone who doesn't understand the theology, why would that accusation be made by Sunnis?
Okay, so the first point is never learn anything online. It really isn't a good place for anything.
Well, I start with the misconceptions because that's what people see first.
And in fact, online, whether it's Catholic, Protestant, or Shia Sunni, you're going to get that. You know, there are members of the Shia community who regard Shia Islam as the original true brand of Islam, and there are members of the Sunni community who regard Shia Islam as unorthodox and even heretical. And therefore, on social media platforms, as with any political or religious animals, they're going to fling accusations or attempted proofs or disprovals of the other. But generally speaking, you know, Shia and Sunni Muslims cohabit throughout the world. In some places, of course, the Shia dominate, a few places. In other places, the Sunni dominate. In many places, a Shia or a Sunni will happily pray in the mosque of the other. It's not such a major issue anymore. And since a good few centuries ago, the Shia began to say we have to stop cursing the Sunni leadership as part of our prayer. It's not a great thing to do. So there has been some coming together, you know, it does. But I think a lot of it has to do with where people are living, where political and religious fever runs hand in hand rather than separately. Yeah. So for someone who knows nothing at all, the Shia community, or the minority community in Islam, And they based themselves on the fact that they thought that when the Prophet of Islam died, his successor should be a member of his family, his successor as community leader. Whereas the Sunni are those who say, no, in theory, it could be any good Muslim. And but it's two brothers, really, two brothers who are now at odds over the inheritance, and they're going to keep being at odds over the inheritance.
No, that's a thorny topic right there. That's a thorny topic right there. I discussed this briefly with another person I interviewed, Halim Kinsogu, talking about sort of higher authorities within the Muslim community, and the effect of the loss of the Caliph with the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And with Shia Islam, you do have that sort of chain of succession a bit, but with Sunni Islam, it's become much more scattered and decentralized. And in my mind, it's just because I have a sort of crude Western sort of approach to this, it seems very much like you've got a Protestant side and a Catholic side almost.
Yes, but I'm interested to know which is which in your mind, because that does differ. Are the Shia the Catholics and the Sunni the Protestants, or vice versa? Because it's a hard argument to win. The point is that the caliphate is a bit like the papacy. I'm not sure it was a great loss. Like the papacy of the medieval period, there was a great deal of corruption and scandal in the caliphate. Many of the caliphs were not great Muslims. And I'm not entirely sure that it was the model of orthodoxy, in the same way that for many centuries, the papacy was not necessarily the model of holiness and goodness. Whereas the Shia do have a cohesion under the hidden imam, as Catholicism has a cohesion under the magisterium. And this does help to streamline what one believes and what doesn't believe. And it does help to eliminate radicalism. Because if you've got a central authority who can tell you that something is truly Islamic or not Islamic, that's remarkably better than having an empty space and having to decide for yourself.
Yes.
So I think that generally, even though they are a minority group, and it's hard to make such a comparison, when it comes to kind of fundamentalistic sort of Islamistic sort of radicalism, you find far less among the Shia than you do among the Sunni. But that's because they are guided by this hidden imam, who is a philosophical guide and a religious guide more than anything else.
Yeah, there's some sort of final point of decision that they can defer to.
Yeah. The buck has to stop somewhere, and if it doesn't, then you could be in quite a lot of trouble.
No, I mean, I think the absence of authority has turned out to be quite a problem as for the Protestant world as well. I mean, the infinite fractionalization of the Christian community that just keeps going on and on and on. Yeah. And I think, one of the funny things that you sort of see in South Africa is that we have such an extraordinary variety of Christian sects, and you speak to most people and they won't know, okay, wait, what's the difference between the African Zionists and the Zionist Christian Church? And there's some people who don't, I speak to people who don't even know what the ZCC are, and they're the fastest growing religious community in the country.
It's interesting that they put quite a lot of emphasis on ritual. Ritual is an important thing. We've dismissed ritual as though it's not necessary, but everybody's whole life is ritualistic. Everything we do is a form of our own private ritual. And ritual gives expression to things and places in us that words can't express. It's a pity to throw out ritual. And I think Shiism, Catholicism, the Zionists, for example, all of these groups, whether they're political or religious, that have held on to ritual, they may be looked down upon, but I think they're very wise not to let it go too easily.
Yes, I mean, with the Catholic Church, I've noticed recently, looking at a lot of the developments, like in the United States, you see the communities that are liberalizing and dropping all of the strictures of the old church seem to be losing members, and then the strict, austere Orthodox Christians are drawing in new, younger members. And how do you see these changes affecting the church at the moment? Because you're quite close to the center of it at the moment. Are these changes very large, or are they still sort of regionalized and so on?
No, I think especially now with the German church going, I mean, it's not the first time the German church has gone off. I mean, in a sense, I mean, it started the Reformation. I'm not surprised the German church is causing trouble. No offense to my German friends, but really, it's not the first time. I follow quite closely a prediction made by Benedict XVI when he was still Cardinal Ratzinger in 67. In 67 already, he was saying, we're going to be a much reduced church. We're going to lose a great many of our institutions and our personnel. We will be a tiny group, but we will be a group that's serious about being church. We may have lost a lot of members, but the people who are still present are there because they want to be with all their hearts. And back in 67, he was seeing this already. Now, this may have been an effect of his own rather unstable relationship with the politics of the time, because he was horrified by what he was seeing in universities. Fair enough. But what he said is coming to pass. I mean, COVID alone has reduced our numbers, and we're not going to get those numbers back. I mean, any priest in London will tell you, any priest in South Africa will tell you, we're not getting the people back, because I think a whole lot of people have found life is much easier without getting up and going to church on a Sunday. And that's sad, but it's a reality we have to live with.
Yes, I mean, I like to be a little bit more hopeful myself that these things will have a little bit more elasticity to them.
We hope so.
Because I mean, the church doesn't just simply have the ritualistic function; it also binds communities together. And I mean, there's that incredibly flexible word that the Muslims tend to use, referring to the ummah, which tends to either refer to the community around your own mosque or to the whole religion, and that sort of centrality of a communion amongst people is. I think it's not overlooked very much, and I see a lot of hand wringing from secular modernists, particularly liberal types, who worry that this loss of community, this atomization, the sort of moral dependence on the state, has sort of impoverished us quite a good deal. And I think this is particularly pertinent to South Africa, because while we have still got a very Christian population, and quite a conservative one, our upper classes, our ruling classes, are predominantly atheist, left-leaning, and progressive. And over time, this is going to trickle down somewhat. And I don't think we've really asked the question of whether we agree with this direction as a sort of community to be clear about it.
It would be interesting to know statistics now from South Africa in terms of percentage who are nominally Christian and those who are practicing Christianity, because Islam, of course, is a minority in South Africa. Islam is a tiny group in South Africa. Whereas, in my youth, it was the Calvinistic churches among the white community that dominated. But I'm not so sure what sort of shifts have taken place in terms of population movement and in terms of religious movement as well. It's very hard now to find statistics. We can talk about Christian nations or predominantly Christian nations, but in the West, that's becoming more and more difficult, because of the move of populations from the Middle East. I'm not even happy so much to talk about, the Muslim East and the Christian West, because it doesn't quite work so well anymore. You've got huge numbers of Muslim immigrants who have set up thriving communities in places like London, for example, whole areas of London. And so it's hard to get a handle exactly on what the future is. I think the church will continue, of course, to perform a vital function. I just think it's going to be reduced in terms of institutions, in terms of its externals, because there are a whole lot of other angles to that as well, economic angles.
I hear optimistic noises from people who point to the difference in birth rates amongst the secular and the religious, and that the sort of secular break is not actually sustainable. And I think this argument has some merit, largely because if you look at the statistics in the United States, for example, and I think they apply to a lot of Western Europe as well, the people who are becoming atheists tend to be from mainstream Protestant denominations, whereas those who belong to Eastern Orthodox, Catholic, or Lutheran, or these sort of more hardcore evangelical churches, tend to maintain their religiosity intergenerationally far better.
A very interesting example are the Amish, because the Amish, of course, maintain this very, very strict religious discipline, and yet they do allow youngsters to go out and see if they want to be part of a wider world. And the statistics of those who come back and those who don't are very interesting. It seems to me that the majority come back. They don't stay out in a wider world. I'm also certain that there's a huge role being played now by the sort of ideologies that are being hammered in universities, that people are getting thumped with ideologies that run counter to the face of any religious virtue, even any religious morality that they may have learned at home, and that often youngsters in a university don't have the tools to fight back, because you've got these extremely left-wing radical professors who obviously have at their disposal, more academic, I don't say more learning, but more academic information. That's quite hard for people in universities.
I mean, this is true. There is sort of the modern universities are sort of secular colleges of, if I may be crude, anti-Christianity. And I think this is the one thing that seems to unite all the different divisions in modern secular philosophy, is that they all despise Christianity. It's quite remarkable. It's a remarkable sort of consonance that when I first recognized it, because I used to be a communist. I used to be quite sort of radical when I was in my undergrad days, and so when I turned away from it and I recognized that that was the one thread that sort of was common between all of these different, fascism, communism, liberalism, this postmodern stuff, all of it, the one thing that they all agree on is saying no to Christianity. Quite a remarkable thing.
They also seem to be quite united in saying no to free speech, because more and more in places like England and America, we're seeing universities forbidding people whose ideology they don't agree with, and generally it's people whose ideology is more right-wing, forbidding them from coming on campus and from speaking. And that's a great worry as well, because in theory liberalism should be the great defender of free speech, but it's not.
Well, I mean, that would be that. I think people tend to forget that liberals used to cut tens of thousands of people's heads off for disagreeing with them back in the French Revolution and actually up to the 19th century. So the idea that the liberals are these cuddly, freedom-loving people, it also ignores what the United States has done in the name of liberating different parts of the world. So I think people like to flatter themselves that they've found some kind of, oh no, we have finally arrived at this answer that is going to bring peace and prosperity and tolerance to everyone. And I mean, it doesn't matter which idea you pick. I mean, to quote a very cliched line from what's his name, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the line of good and evil runs through every human heart. You're not going to come up with some abstract formula that's going to banish evil forever.
No. But these are warring trends. I mean, and I'm not sure. There was a time when the church was equipped for this. At the turn of the 19th, 20th century, there were huge numbers of intellectuals pouring into the church, and we were equipped for this. Now, at the moment, we're not producing many great theologians. And if you ask your average Catholic, for example, who's the top theologian at the moment, they generally don't know, because there aren't that many. There's a whole generation of men like Balthasar and de Lubac who have died out now, and they're not really being replaced. I mean, there are a few, but it's not as if we're pouring out some really great thinkers.
It seems like there's sort of an almost apologetic or defensive, retreating, sort of back-footed stance, where everyone feels like, well, we have to make our apologies to the secular order, instead of saying, well, no, we're on the side of right. It's the secular that has to be judged by our standards. the only theologian that I've come across in the modern times who seems to really address this whole mess, at least to my satisfaction, is actually the Orthodox fellow, which I assume you've come across, called Father Seraphim Rose.
Yes.
I mean, I would imagine, I mean, I know that he has a lot of negative things to say about the Catholic Church, as any fundamentalist Orthodox would, but I wonder what you'd make, assuming you've read his, in Dialectic of Nihilism and these books, what you'd make of that as a sort of preparatory introduction to modern ideas for those who might want to inoculate their sort of young and enthusiastic university-going offspring.
I'm afraid I've read none of him, I'm ashamed to say. So my library is filled with mostly Islamic texts at this stage, so I haven't read much of it.
Well, that's fair enough. It's interesting. There's one thing that I noticed you and Abdul Hakim Murad both saying about Islam, is that there's a lack of appreciation in the Islamic world for the sort of treasures of the religious discipline. And he mentions a story where he goes into Egypt, and he goes to this library where all of these like very, very special old texts from the early days are kept, and many great theologians. And the windows are open, and there's birds that are coming in and roosting on top of the bookshelves. And he opens a book, and there's coffee stains and nonsense all over it, and no one's looking after these things. And you can almost see him grinding his teeth through the whole speech. And I feel sorry for the man, because it must be so because I feel it's a little bit distressing, even though I'm starting to leave the sort of Western secular ideological world behind somewhat. Watching it get wholesale rejected in a sort of symbolic book burning by the Western universities is still quite atrocious.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting the point that he makes, because of course these religious traditions and religious practices were certainly preserved by the mystics of Islam, but the mystics were never regarded by mainstream Islam as orthodox. Even now, in many places, the mystics, the so-called Sufi mystics, the real, well, not these whirling dervish types who do it for the tourists, I mean real mystics, they are still not regarded as orthodox by Sunni or by Shia Islam, and yet they are the ones who have preserved some very early, at times syncretistic practices, which they picked up from other religions in terms of order and discipline of life, discipline of prayer. But it's not, traditionally in Islam, you have the Quran and the Sharia, and these give the order and the spirituality and the theology to your life. And to step outside of those, or to use a language that seems to be beyond what the sacred language of the text is offering, is a little worrisome. But so the Shia hold on to their passion and their ritual, the Sunni hold on to their law, their Sharia to guide them, and this is how they create spaces for themselves, or spaces for their spiritual lives to form.
I heard you make one remark in an interview that I watched of yours, where when you were talking about interfaith relationships, or relations, shall I say, you said something about not wanting to proselytize, and I know that there is a duty to try and spread the gospel, so to speak, and one has to believe that, if you believe that this is the word of God, this is the way to salvation, then you should want others to accept it as their way of life. And I was wondering what your reasoning is to take this sort of, I don't want to be too blunt about it, but it's sort of a quietist sort of tolerance.
Well, yeah. No, I know exactly what it is. It's because the church was faced around the 60s when it started talking about interreligious dialogue. it was faced with a massive problem, and that is, what do you do? Do you send missionaries to missionize, or do you send dialoguers to dialogue? Because they seem to be opposite things. Do you dialogue with another religion to discover what we hold in common, or do you preach the gospel? Because the thought was, you can't do both. You have to do one or the other. And until finally the church began to formulate this idea that interreligious dialogue ought to be a preparation for preaching the gospel, for mission, for proselytism, if you like. That proselytism has to come at the end of a fairly long process of preparation. It's the idea of sowing the seed and then not digging it up every few minutes to see if it's growing, just leaving it to grow. I've learned from experience that a religion like Islam, you're not going to just walk in and produce a gospel and start demanding that people submit. That just doesn't work. But to build up healthy, trusting friendships where you can begin to talk about your religious convictions without being a threat to the other, that for me is the most important part of the journey. After that, all kinds of things begin to happen. You inspire each other, or you give a good example to each other. But the old idea of mission, and there are two old ideas of mission. The one was the white missionaries came in bringing all kinds of important things like medicine and education. And that was a crucial role, I think, that they played. They certainly did play a role, but it wasn't necessarily the best way of doing mission. The other, of course, is this blunt kind of thumping people with the gospel and hammering them in your tent. I'm not sure if that's very good either, but if you can build up friendship and trust, people can talk about anything. And be unthreatened by it. So when I talk to Muslim friends, I'm not in any way threatened by their challenges. Hopefully they're not threatened by mine, but hopefully we inspire each other in some way, and that it might be the sowing of a seed that will produce fruit later on.
It's funny you mentioned that, because your work's to sort of deeply understand the other before you start sort of delivering your own position. It makes me think of the work that you saw missionaries do in South Africa, where before they stepped into openly proselytizing, they first went to live with the people, learned their languages, standardized spellings for them, translated the Bible, like fairly heavy work before you can before you sort of really get stuck into the whole proselytism thing. And I think it's, in a manner of speaking, this thing is crucial. One, you have to understand someone else before you can make any sort of advances on them.
There was an Irish priest in Cape Town, Matthew Gormley, who I think must be dead by now. Matthew Gormley spoke better Xhosa than most Xhosas, and he used to correct Xhosa speakers in their grammar. His Xhosa was so perfect, and they accepted it, that his Xhosa was perfect. So he spent years, and he wasn't the only one, living amongst Xhosa communities, learning language, taking on parts of culture, like the food parts and other parts of culture. And that was how he did mission. And I think this is exactly the point. And all of these historical people like Charles de Foucault and others all said the same thing. You've got to enculturate. Now, I use Charles de Foucault with a slight question mark, because I have a doubt about him. I mean, blessed Charles de Foucault, the little brother of Jesus, a slight worry about him, in that he also used to store guns.
Just for anyone listening, that's not a relation of Michel Foucault.
No, completely different family, both problematic. But all of these missionaries, these really good missionaries, said you've got to go. It's incarnational. You take on the flesh of the other. You live with them. You get to know them and trust them, and then you can begin to tell them the most important thing you have to tell them. The most important thing you have to tell them. So you prepare for it. It's like preparing somebody to get some bad news. You take a few precautions. It's exactly the same.
Almost like a courtship ritual in a way.
It's like a courtship ritual.
I think there's a very it's a very interesting approach, because you would have had to form very close bonds with the Muslim community in the 90s to get involved in the activism that you did. Now, I for those who know me, they know I'm quite a staunch proponent of drug prohibition. I've done research on it, and I believe that it can be done without costing too much in terms of, persecuting people and throwing them in jail or anything. I mean, one only has to look at Japan or South Korea to see that you don't need mass incarceration to enforce good drug control. But in South Africa, we have this absence of authority, both moral and temporal. And so the proliferation of the gangs and combating them has fall into the community. How did you and the rest of the Cape community approach this in the 90s to begin with, before it all went pear-shaped as we now know?
Yeah. Look, it's very, very hard to get people to understand what it was like to live in a place like Manenberg. Now, I need to say, the Manenberg years were without doubt the best years of my life. I was in love with the place despite the horrors. I mean, I went in after a priest had been murdered, and I went and replaced him. So it was, from day one, it was kind of traumatic, but I absolutely loved Manenberg, and I loved the years I was there. And I still tell people I would go back tonight. If you gave me a plane ticket, I'd go back to Manenberg. But it's hard to get people who've never been into a Cape Flats area to understand the horrors, excuse me, in terms of alcohol abuse, in terms of broken families, in terms of physical abuse of people, and in terms of drug abuse, including the gangsters. I, as a priest in 5 or 6 years in Manenberg, on average buried 3 gangsters a week, 3 teenagers who'd been killed in gang fights. And I know that some people become hardened to that, but you never become hardened when you see a mother who might herself be quite involved in the gang, but who's lost herself. So, vigilantism is not a great thing, but it is a natural reaction that people embrace when nobody seems to be able to do anything. And if you've got a police force which is, unfortunately, in some parts corrupt, and that's just the sad truth of police forces all over the world generally, and the police and the government seem able to not to help, then you begin to take action. And so the people against gangs and drugs and gangsterism and drugs began as nothing more than a group of educated people. I mean, we were all lawyers or priests or doctors or something, just, people, school teachers, who formed a group to go to government and to begin to nag. You've got to do something. And I can clearly remember government ministers refusing to even speak to us. They wouldn't even see us. I can remember going to visit one well-known government minister who hid in his office and persuaded his secretary to tell us he wasn't there. And we said, fine, we'll wait. And we sat outside his office until he came out. I can remember going to see Dullah Omar, a whole group of us. And Dullah Omar did not seem to understand that there are more ways of getting drugs into a country than in the harbors. For example, try the airports, not big airports, little airports where little flights are coming. So it was that. And we came to a conclusion that they simply would not accept what we were saying. And I was also living in the situation where people were dying. It's not pop guns they're shooting at each other. They are real guns and people are dying in the crossfire. And so I wasn't surprised when the movement, of which I was certainly, in a sense, a founder member, I suppose. And I'm not ashamed to say that, because it started off as a really great idea and it was unified. And wasn't surprised when it turned into a form of vigilante. I think they made a number of mistakes. And the first mistake, and I say it as one who has countless Muslim friends, is they were too Muslim. If your externals are so Islamic, you're not going to attract people who are not Muslim and who don't fit in with that. So you can't keep meeting at the mosque. That's not helpful. But also when they embraced violence, that was the end, because then you have a real moral issue that I don't have the legal ability to deal with. But I just don't believe that it's the way to go. But it began as something heartfelt, and for a moment there was a burst of excitement that finally, in a place like Manenberg, later in a place like Tafelberg, where I was after Manenberg, and Tafelberg is just bigger Manenberg, that we were going to do this. We were going to, and then, as you say, it went pear-shaped, and it's a great pity, because since then nothing seems to have taken off. Everything seems to, other attempts to keen not to. I regularly hear, of people, people getting shot. A few weeks ago, all these kids were shot in Tufts. I regularly hear communities marching and saying enough is enough. My goodness, they've been saying enough is enough since the 1980s, and it hasn't worked, So I can understand why people, if you were protecting your own son or daughter or your wife or whoever you want to protect, you'd do anything. You really would. That's the nature of the beast, not just among animals, but among human animals too. We will do anything to protect the ones we love. One can understand that.
Yeah, I think anyone who lives in Cape Town for any length of time, provided they're not completely ensconced in the tiny little bubble that hugs the mountain, you do get a taste for the effects of this on the psyche of the city. And what strikes me as rather extraordinary, and it's in another interview that I did with J.P. Smith, who's the Minister of Safety and Security for Cape Town. Not Minister, Head of Portfolio. I made that mistake with him. He corrected me very good.
Whatever that means, yeah.
So he pointed out that there is what I would describe as a concerted plan by the ruling party to support and defend the gangs, especially since Jacob Zuma signed that deal with them in 2011, to protect them so that they can undermine the credibility of the Democratic Alliance's ruling capacity. And so 50% of the murders in the whole province can be attributed to a program of simple political pettiness. And I mean, I think a lot of people now, what strikes me a lot about, because there's now this movement for Cape independence. A lot of people tend to be white middle class liberals, and their big reasons for leaving are things like, well, the tax is too high and we're not getting any services. But it always struck me that perhaps the most important issues to look at are the things that are impacting people's ability to survive. And I think these are quite overlooked. I mean, how do you think how do you think you would go about bringing these things to people's attention? Because we have a problem now, and this is the flip side of this sort of left-wing maneuver, left-wing development, this progress stuff, is that you have people who react to it, and in building their sort of defenses against this new pseudo morality, they make themselves inured to the suffering that critical tradition was initially created to bring attention to.
I kind of think that's always been our problem in South Africa. That's always been the issue, that we were completely cut off from our neighbors. So, the woman who used to come in every day and clean the house for us, we barely knew her name. We didn't know where she lived. We certainly never went to her house. It's been like that from the beginning. And, I used to sit and talk to close friends in Cape Town about life in Manenberg. They didn't believe me. They thought I was making it up as I went along. They genuinely did not believe that any community, I mean, I can remember, this is just two examples. I can remember quite clearly that if you were out in the street, and I never drove a car in Manenberg because you can walk Manenberg. It's a very good idea if you're the only white person living there to walk it, because then they know you're not a policeman, you're a priest, and nobody has a problem with that. But quite often, gunfights would break out in the middle of the day, and then you would just lie down in the street. Everybody did it, and you could continue to have a conversation with somebody lying next to you. It was the norm. Or you could just open the nearest door and walk into the person's house, and they would know that you were coming to take refuge. That wasn't surprising. It was normative. It's how people lived. And try and explain that to people who've never experienced, they don't know what, they genuinely think you're making it up. That's how we live. And to give people a taste of that, how do you give people a taste of that? I don't know.
I mean, I sit here in the Netherlands, and because I've just graduated from my master's degree here, and I tell people what the homicide rate is in South Africa. And I had someone point out to me that was it's higher than the current homicide rate in Syria. And they're accepting refugees from Syria in this part of the world. And South Africa is just sort of like it's like no one, and that this can happen without a civil war. You know, we've had 500,000 people die since the end of apartheid from ordinary homicides.
Yeah. Look, here in Italy, if there is a murder, the whole country grinds to a halt. It's just unheard of for there to be. There was a murder of a policeman in Rome a year ago. 2 American kids killed a policeman. The whole country, just because the Italians, they're used to all kinds of nonsense in terms of corruption at higher levels. They're used to pickpockets, they're used to petty crime, but murder, people don't kill each other. And one murder will dominate the headlines of the country for weeks and weeks and weeks. It is just unheard of. Whereas, you know, we in South Africa, well, you know, I don't want to say we've lost a sense of the sacredness of human life, because it's driven by something. It's not just, oh, I don't think I'll respect humanity anymore. It's far more serious than that. It's driven by the drug problem or by the social problems which force people into a corner, and they just see no way out. I'm not ashamed to say it. I'm a great Jordan Peterson fan. I really am a really great Jordan Peterson fan. I kind of want to say to Jordan Peterson, I think you should come and give some lectures, because he seems to have a grip on tragedy and trauma and how to get out of it that few people have, and he's articulate about it.
It's great.
And
I have a criticism. So he's done, and this is something I don't know if you know the British journalist Peter Hitchens.
Oh yes.
Okay. So I mean, very, very famous thing, if anyone doesn't know, his brother Christopher Hitchens, famous atheist, Peter Hitchens, famous defender of the Anglican faith. So
yeah,
interesting combination. But he said something remarkable about faith and religion, in which he said, you know, I can give you a million reasons why you ought to believe in God, but I can't prove to you that God exists or anything. You have to take the leap of faith. This is pure. You have to choose.
Yeah.
And I've looked at Jordan Peterson, and he gives a million fantastic reasons to believe, and then he himself does not take the leap.
Well, he does, I think. He would certainly claim that he is Christian, that he's in the Christian tradition, and that he is a spiritual man. He certainly claims that. He may not claim a particular denomination, but I'm not sure that he's not taken belief. He just, you know, he speaks at length about these things. I mean, he's given lectures on Bible personalities as good examples, and I've seen his lectures on God. But I mean, I agree with the point that he doesn't often make personal commitment to a particular religious issue. But I've heard him say quite clearly, people have asked him, are you religious and spiritual? He would say, yes, I have to say I definitely am. And really, that's already a step in the right direction. But I agree also with the point that you can give a smoker a million reasons not to smoke, but if he's an addictive personality, he is going to smoke, no matter what you say. And I'm afraid the truth is the same with the drug and gang situation in South Africa, that you can give people reasons why drugs are bad, but it's going to take a little more than that. And I'm not sure. Who do we call?
Reason isn't a magic.
This is it. You know, eventually we need somebody from the outside who has experience. I mean, I've often said in Italy, if the Italians were clever, they'd get the Singaporeans or the Australians to come in and teach them about recycling, because the Italians know nothing about recycling. It's a mess. So you want to find a country that really does it well and get them to come and teach you. You know, how do we in South Africa do it without finding somebody from outside who's cracked this problem to a certain extent at least? Certainly not the Americans. They haven't cracked the problem.
No, I would dare say the Americans. What was it that Winston Churchill said about them? He said, you can trust the Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else.
Yeah. But there are countries, as you've mentioned, where the drug issue is carefully controlled without, you know, excessive. We need to get some help, because alcohol and drugs tears communities apart. I don't care what people say, it destroys communities. And we have enough proof of this. So I understand the pagan movement, and it was heartfelt at the beginning. It was desperate people who were saying they're coming to the gates of the schools and selling drugs to our kids. We can't even monitor that. And it's not just Cape Flat schools. I once dared to tell the headmaster of a white Catholic school, trust me, drugs are being sold in you, and I was shot down in flames. Well, let's have another look then, shall we? Because,
people think that I think white South Africans are so peculiar. You'd think being so close to the violence and depravity that predates upon the rest of the population would give them a bit of sort of a cause for pause. But it seems to be that the sort of sense of exceptionalism remains.
Yeah. So I don't know what the solution is. I don't think vigilantism is the solution. I think that was a gut reaction, and it was normal. It was expected.
Mm.
And if you don't find a solution, you're going to keep having those little attempts. People will keep saying, neighborhood watches are a mild form of vigilantism because communities have to do it.
If the state's not doing it, you've got to do what the state does.
Yeah.
And it's a very unfortunate situation. But I mean, the thing is, I think the great difficulty is that you're stuck with a catch-22. If the government has no interest in doing this job, but doing it yourself runs this enormously dangerous risk. It's not an easy choice for anyone to make, I don't think. And so personally, I hesitate to judge those who went astray with the Pagad program, because as much as I might, in my moments of passion, for example, or perhaps anyone else for that matter, lose their temper, these are people who have been terrorized their whole lives by this problem. And, they've seen loved ones destroyed. They know that they can't walk down the street like a normal citizen and feel at home in their own neighborhood. Any white person when they have their first hijacking, their first break-in, it's always this big traumatic event. You live with that your whole life, and someone hands you the promise of a chance at escaping this. Could you imagine what you'd give for that? Yeah. So I don't judge them. I don't judge them for that at all. Or rather, I don't condemn them.
You can add one element to that for me, and it's especially serious now during this COVID epidemic, and that's the epidemic of mental health issues. The point is that all of those people living in townships and in the Cape Flats who experience daily trauma, almost none of them have any access to any mental health expert. And can you imagine the buildup of trauma when I got a friend who got held up, and he was on a psychologist's couch for a year, and he was taking antidepressants, and I thought, my God, you got held up. There are people getting held up almost on a daily level and watching people getting murdered, and they've got no access to anybody. And that, for me, is going to explode eventually, because it's going to be an issue after COVID. Mental health is going to be the next great epidemic of getting help to people.
Yeah.
Place where the church can really take a lead role.
I might say something rather funny about this. So I'm perhaps a little old-fashioned in that I mostly think that the solution is sort of returning a confidence in morality. And I think it's not just something like, okay, we need to just have some big guy in charge that says these things. It's more that people need to feel confident that those norms do exist, and they need to have faith in it. And that's the real hard part. I looked at, I don't know if you've ever read, there's a man called Norbert Elias. He talks about something called the civilizing effect. So there was someone, someone called Manuel Eisner, who wrote a fantastic paper where he went across Western Europe and collected all of the data from all the little towns on what their homicide rate was, going back to the 13th century. And from the 13th century all the way down, right down till 1945, even including all the wars that happened in between, there's a steep decline in the homicide rate as Christendom deepens its moral control of the society. And after World War II, immediately this line starts inclining. It flattens out a little bit after 1990, and it started climbing again. That flattening in the 1990s largely due to sort of improvements in medical technology and logistics, which mean that people who get stabbed survive because they get to the hospitals on time, they get stitched up in time. And it strikes me that when you look at the sort of assault with deadly weapons statistics in London, they're more violent than at any point in history. They just survive the violence. And if you compare London then to South Africa now, we're living in a constant state of civil war. And I think that people need to appreciate that this is not normal, because we've gotten to the state that we think this is normal, therefore we think this is forever. When we realize how abnormal and bizarre this is to live in this way, I think that should give people hope that it can or must end. You know, it has to. Sure.
We need a catalyst. Something needs something. I mean, to begin a process where people stop saying enough is enough, and they actually say that's it now. And I don't know what that catalyst is. I know that, you know, I get back to South Africa every couple of years. The last time I was back, which was 2 years ago, one of the things that I noticed was how tense everybody was. Everybody looked so strained. Even just people in a supermarket have this tense look about them. And I remember saying to my sisters, what is this? Everybody looks so tense and everybody looks on edge. You know, even just doing ordinary everyday things, you know, you're not about to start a race. You're not being held up in a bank. You're just, you know, picking out fruit in Pick and Pay. Why are you looking so tense? And it's that deep awareness, I think, that something's not right and nobody quite knows what's going to happen next.
I didn't really notice it myself until I left. When I first came to the Netherlands, and I just felt every day my stress level was lower than the previous day. There's not one part of the Netherlands that is more violent than the safest neighborhood in South Africa. And I can go anywhere, nothing worries me. I can, you know, I mean, I know we've seen the policemen being a bit vicious with the protesters recently, but policemen over here, they give you the time of day, they show you directions if you don't know where you're going. You know, it's an entirely different world.
Absolutely.
Entirely different world. You know, I mean, they complain about the immigrants, you know, bringing crime, and that's statistically debatable. But even in the worst place, I mean, people talk about, Schilderswijk in Den Haag, you know, and I think, well, yes, but the crime figures over there, I would, you know, if I could find a neighborhood in South Africa with that homicide rate, I'd move there immediately.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's pretty much the same here. And I mean, I worked in America for a while, and the parish priest used to get so angry with me for locking the door. I used to lock the front door at night. And he said, what's the matter with you? And I said, I can't not lock the front door. I can't not. You know, this was admittedly rural Pennsylvania, you know, but he couldn't understand my psyche, that things should be locked and the church should be closed and locked at night. He couldn't understand that. He just left everything open. What you know, that in itself is a form of great brings, as you know, as your stress levels drop, all kinds of healing takes place. It's a wonderful experience, but it's to get, I mean, I used to say, if we could just get people out of this somewhere else, you know, it would be great. But
just to give them a vision of how it can be, that it's possible, you know, and I think it's that defeatism, that inability to believe that things could be different.
Yeah.
Because all they've seen is decline. All they've seen is increasing violence and depravity.
Yeah.
And it has to change.
And in theory, I mean, I used to watch by 5 o'clock in the morning, people on their way out in taxis to work. They don't see the sunrise. They come back after the sun has set, also in taxis, straight home to feed the kids and fix up meals. And they don't see the world around them. They see nothing around, nothing. And, you know, it reminds me of the sort of people staggering around in Plato's vision who don't realize, you know, they're staggering around and they don't realize the idea of the cave. They don't realize the idea of there's something else, something bigger.
Yeah, I mean,
It's sadness.
I remember Noam Chomsky used to make this point a lot when in Manufacturing Consent. He talked about how the ordinary person cannot consume news except in small bites that are pre-prepared for them by people who have a particular worldview they want to sell. And because they only see this like tiny little sliver of light in the camera obscura of their lives, they're stuck with what's sold to them.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think with look, I think that's kind of the problem we face, is trying to borrow a left-wing term, is to conscientize people somewhat, to give them a different view, to give them a different frame of reality. And I think that I don't know how much you notice this, but perhaps churches in South Africa have become a bit stuck in their ways themselves, and the people who should be able to say there is hope of a better world end up sort of saying, no, this is how it will always be.
Yeah. Look, that's always a problem in churches. That it's the same crowd year after year doing the same things and resisting any sort of change. And that's not unique to South Africa. I've seen it everywhere else. Resisting any sort of possibility that something could be done slightly differently, and it creates huge battles. But partly perhaps because for some people the church is their security. That's the place where they know how things work. They know the order of things. They know the 10 Commandments. And they don't want anybody coming in and disturbing that, because life is already chaotic outside of the bounds of that. That's their safe space, or their happy space, for want of a better word. And they take umbrage against anybody who will threaten that. It's not only churches that become the safe space for people. It's not only that. But I've seen that, and it plays itself out year after year. As a parish priest, trying to change your personnel, trying to change some of the people who make decisions, it's a very difficult thing, because this person's been doing it for so long, and they do it competently, and it's part of their life, and they feel rejected, and it's major. And look, churches are little microcosms of a wider society, which is just so non-functional at times, so dysfunctional at times. But they also do a lot of good, and they, even if it is just a safe space for somebody, I'm happy they've got a safe space. One of the things I work in London every year for a couple of months in Westminster Cathedral. One of the great things about Westminster Cathedral is you walk past it on Victoria Street, and unlike Westminster Abbey, where you queue for hours to pay to go in, Westminster Cathedral's open all day. The lights are on, and all kinds of people go in and sit there for the whole day. People with mental health issues, for example, because it's safe and it's warm and nobody interferes with them and everyone's kind to them. And in that alone, Westminster Cathedral is performing a great function, without meaning to. It's actually being Jesus Christ and the gospel for people who have got nowhere else to go. And if they're just going to sit there and sleep in a corner for a whole day, that's fine by me, because we promise you'll be safe here and you'll be cared for here if we can care for you. And I think that's what the church needs now to be. It needs to be a haven for people, from the chaos. It can't itself fix the chaos, because I'm not sure how we're going to fix the chaos, but people still need places of sanctuary and refuge, as Desdemona learned when Quasimodo whipped her into the bell tower. People do need, safe space. Maybe I think our future is going to be a lot with providing people with hope. I keep saying mental health because I'm quite preoccupied that mental health issues, I'm seeing it.
Well-being, I mean, that's where psychology comes from. It's the logos of spirit.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that the church will say, well, here's an area we can really invest our energy into, because nobody else is doing it, or nobody, we don't have enough people doing it. So we will see.
I think that's a fantastic way to end that, is work on the spiritual well-being.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. Well, the last time I was in Amsterdam, I absolutely loved it, and I vowed that if I won the lotto, the super lotto in Italy, I'd come live in Amsterdam. That's not going to happen.
Oh no, I prefer the sort of quiet towns in the south, to be honest. Amsterdam is a bit too much for me right now.
And do you miss Cape Town? Do you kind of feel a hankering for Cape Town?
Yes and no. I mean, when I return, I plan to return to Wellington actually. Um,
Oh, okay.
so yeah, so winelands, nice and quiet. You know.
Apple country. I kind of, yeah, I get bouts of kind of homesickness, but not for South Africa, for Cape Town specifically, and certain things about Cape
I
Town.
know. I think people are taught in the modern world to identify with these weird abstractions, like South Africa. What is South Africa? Is like the whole world is so diverse. The idea that it doesn't really have like an identity or a nationhood to it.
Yeah.
But you can feel that when you're in your place, you're home.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Anyway,
on that note,
on
thank
that
you
note,
very much for coming and talking to me.
it's a great pleasure anytime, and keep safe and well. I hope you get the vaccine soon if you haven't had it. We've all had it here. We're all us Vatican people, who's ahead of everyone else.
Ah,
Ah,
I see.
by hook or by crook. So I hope that you all get it there soon enough.
Alrighty then.
Good. You keep well.
All right then. Goodbye.
Okay. Bye bye now.